Hello, and welcome to the BSI Education Podcast with me, Matthew Childs.
And me, Alan Sellers.
Hello, Alan. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. And how are you, Matthew?
I'm very well, thank you. Now, in these podcasts, our aim is to bring you the stories behind standards and standardisation. In this episode, we hear from Dr Irina Brass, Associate Professor for the Department of Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy at University College London.
Now, what struck me, Matthew, on listening to Irina was her passion and enthusiasm for standards education. She laid down some challenges to universities, standards bodies, and standards makers about how standards can and should inform policy making.
Now, we really enjoyed our conversation with Irina, and we hope you do too. So, in this episode of the podcast, we are delighted to be joined by Dr. Irina Brass. Hello, Irina. How are you?
Hi, Matthew. Hi, Alan. It's a real pleasure to be with you, and thank you very much for the invite. It's a real pleasure and a real honor.
It's a very great pleasure to have you. Now, you're an academic in the Department of Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy at UCL, or STEaPP for short. Can you tell us a bit about STEaPP and your role there?
Sure. So I'm an associate professor, newly promoted to associate professor at UCL, that's University College London. As you mentioned, in STEaPP, which stands for the Department of Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy. This is quite a unique department in the sense that it is an interdisciplinary department which sits in the Faculty of Engineering and that explores exactly what it says on the tin. This relationship between science, technology, engineering, and public policy. So I think the discussion that we had recently around COVID-19 and what happens with science advice has maybe also given us an opportunity to be a bit more explicit and to put a pin into what we're doing in this department, which is essentially how do we translate scientific and technological engineering expertise and knowledge for public policy, and vice versa. How do we actually create an environment where those who operate in the public policy domain can learn more about the science, technology, and engineering issues and challenges that are being faced. So it's creating this dialogue between science, technology, and engineering and the public policy environment. And I have to say that I'm really proud to be part of this department. It's one of the few in the world. As I mentioned before, the message, especially now in this context, when we're talking about systemic risk, when we're talking about understanding how to create baseline for best practices, this is a very good place to be.
And in terms of your teaching and research?
In terms of research, I specialize in the regulation of emerging technologies. So I look at the interplay between regulation, responsible innovation, and how we can translate that to meet the public policy objectives of the 21st century. I have a particular interest in this idea of regulation for responsible innovation or regulation of responsible innovation. But I have to say that I take a slightly different approach than maybe what is conventionally understood in this space. In the sense, when I'm thinking of regulation, first of all, I'm thinking of regulation that doesn't come just from government. So I'm not thinking only about mandatory regulation of responsible innovation or regulation of emerging technologies, but actually about self-regulatory practices where standards actually fit into this bigger picture in terms that they allow for achievement of the same goals or some of the same goals that potentially mandatory regulatory intervention would. So I have to say from the start, and this is my caveat always, that when I say that I specialize in the regulation of emerging technologies, regulation of responsible innovation, I take regulation as this broad a spectrum of mandatory to a very much self-regulatory practices that are out there and standards obviously fit in that category. The second point that I want to raise is, yes, in my research, I also focus on adaptive regulatory practices. So this is where I'm actually looking at how we can create more adaptive regulation, where we can integrate knowledge about risks that are pertaining to emerging technologies, but to integrate them in existing regulatory models, existing regulatory frameworks in a more systematic manner, so that that knowledge that comes from expert communities, again, standards being one of them, but not the only ones, there are other epistemic communities out there, can be integrated and can create more dynamic regulatory responses. So what I've done from the research side is I focused so far on two areas. The first area is in, if you wish, cybersecurity, especially looking at the cybersecurity of emerging technologies such as the Internet of Things, such as machine learning. So here is very much about how we integrate, how we understand the risks that are emerging risks in cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is not like safety, for instance, that we've done for a really long time, and really create more adaptive regulatory practices. Another area that I focused on is in advanced biotherapeutics. So this is cell and gene therapies. Again, here looking at adaptive regulatory pathways that allow these innovations to happen, but also to happen in a responsible manner. What we try to do, and what I try to do from a teaching perspective, is I try to integrate this research that I've developed together with the STEaPP community, as well as a broader community of collaborators, into the teaching practice. So what we have at UCL is something called the connected curriculum, which is ultimately about how we integrate our research and our policy engagement, and we do a lot of policy engagement at STEaPP, into our teaching in the Masters of Public Administration that we do, in some of the undergraduate courses that we teach, and also in how we supervise doctoral research and postdoctoral researchers as well.
That's really fascinating. I want to pick up on your approach to teaching standards in a moment, if that's okay. But before we move on, I understand you've won some awards recently.
Yes, thank you very much. And this is an absolute honor. So the year started, the academic year, because I always think in academic year, so that starts in September and ends in August of every year. So at the beginning of the academic year, I was very honored to receive a nomination for the BSI Standards Makers Award for education about standardization. And I'm really, really pleased to have received that award. So that was an absolute achievement in terms of actually conveying the message that we want to do when it comes to the connected curriculum and when it comes to research-based education. And later in the year, very recently in June, for the same endeavor, so for the whole principle of designing research-based education, and in collaboration with the BSI as well for the MPA group projects that we've done together, which I know we will discuss later on. I also received the UCL's Provost Education Award. So these are some of the career pinnacles for someone at this stage in their career. And I'm absolutely proud and very, very honored to have received them. And I have to say that I couldn't have done them without the collaborations that I've established over the years and the dedication of those who were part of this endeavor.
Now, this is a podcast about standardization, and I'm keen on understanding how our guests end up where they are today. So, how did you get to be in this place of talking about public policy, standards, and research?
So, thanks for this question. And, you know, the more that I sort of progress in my career, the longer the journey becomes, which is great. But at the same time, it also looks far in the past. So I'm going to try to do a summary, as much of a summary as I can. So I started off doing my undergraduate studies in international relations and media and communications. So I did actually a double degree in international relations and media and comms, because I realized that I was interested in sort of politics and international politics, but I was also very much interested in what was happening in the media, comms, digital environment. So I couldn't decide. So I decided to do both of them. And then I moved on for my master's, and I did an MSc at LSE in politics and government in the European Union. And that's where I took a class that I think changed my my direction in terms of my research interests, my educational interests, and also my passion to research and also to convey this message of the importance of regulation as a broader spectrum, right? Not just regulation as mandatory regulation. So I took this class called Regulation of the Single Market, and that's where I learned more about digital technologies and regulation of radio spectrum, of broadcasting, of telecommunications at that time. So then from that point onwards, I wanted to develop a PhD, which I did. So I stayed at LSE, and now I have a PhD in government from the LSE Department of Government. And for that particular piece of research, which was my first piece of substantial research, I wanted to investigate how radio spectrum policy for mobile communications is formed and is being decided. Because we all know that radio spectrum is a common pool resource in the same that it is scarce to the extent that the technology allows it. And not a lot of people are actually aware of the fact that we rely on this invisible resource, which is the electromagnetic spectrum and then what we call the radio spectrum, for all of our mobile communications, all of our Wi-Fi, et cetera, et cetera. But I wasn't at the same time convinced that the regulators play the only role in deciding it, and that it's all about politics. So I wanted to look deeper into that. And that's when I started to look around and see, as part of the research, and see who else is important in this space. And that's when I discovered standards making organizations. That's when I discovered STEaPP, that's when I discovered the IEEE, that's where I discovered 3GPP, and also very importantly, that's when I discovered national standards bodies and the role that they play. And then I realized that actually it's not just, this is not to say that there isn't politics around it. This is not to say that regulators don't play a role around it. That's why I argued in my thesis. But that actually these technical expert communities, these what I call epistemic communities, play a fundamental role in deciding how this particular resource, yes, this invisible resource, which we call the electromagnetic spectrum, the radio spectrum, is managed and is being allocated over the years. So that was my first moment where I got into standards making organizations, and since then there was no turn back.
That's fascinating. There seems to be a very clear thread that you've pulled there of recognizing something was happening and then carrying on pulling that thread to see what was at the end and arriving at national standards bodies. I find it interesting that you've arrived at that from coming from a regulator perspective rather than a technical perspective. And I wonder if there's anything that you could see in the difference between a technical angle on standards versus a policy or a regulatory angle in the perspectives that they bring.
To me, bringing technical expertise and bringing regulatory and policy expertise are two sides of the same coin. That communication that I mentioned at the start that we're trying to do at STEaPP, where we try to bridge these communities together, and also from a research perspective, try to understand how these communities speak to each other, is fundamental. So I don't necessarily see a difference between these communities, but what I see very important is how they look at one issue from different angles, and then what is the trade-off, the negotiation in between. So that's essentially what I am interested in, what I'm doing in all the research that I've been doing so far. So for instance, After the PhD, I joined UCL STEaPP as a postdoc before I became a lecturer and now an associate professor. And I joined as a postdoc in the Petras Internet of Things Research Hub, which has now become a center of excellence in cybersecurity of the Internet of Things. There, the issue was, how do we deal with this problem that is emerging around the cybersecurity of more and more connected devices? So we no longer have just the phone or just our computer that is connected to the internet. Now we have all of these other devices around our house. We have connected autonomous vehicles. We have we talk about smart meters and the smart grid. All of these are connected and are relying on the internet infrastructure. And for them to function well, they require a high level of cybersecurity, but they also require, most importantly, a baseline of what good cybersecurity practice is. And what I found is that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, what the technical community brings to the table and what the policy and regulatory community wants to achieve is not necessarily aligned. So being at the forefront of ensuring that this communication exists and translating it, understanding it from a research perspective, but also translating it, facilitating this discussion is one of my ambitions. So it's not to say that technical versus policy, but it's to say, how do we marry technical and policy so that we can create those baseline practices that would support policy objectives, but are also in line with the latest technical requirements. And I don't think that only regulation or only a technical community can achieve on their own.
Irina, I can see from an academic's perspective how you described how your sort of research interests were sort of aroused by the relationship between standards and regulation and policy development. Now, obviously, you're an academic working in a successful UK university, but in recent years, you've also become a standards maker in the area of IoT and Internet of Things. And I just wondered, what was your motivation there? I can understand how, from a research perspective, you want to get to grips with some of the key issues you've been talking about, but why also become a standards maker too? What were your motivations?
So first of all, I'm a huge believer in the idea of the embedded researcher. If we want to study something, we don't have to conduct interviews. We don't have to, sit in as participant observers in particular environments. We have to actually understand what the community is about and contribute. And that's how we see our research in practice. So I'm a huge believer of that. So that's why when it comes to the interaction that I've had, for instance, with the BSI, I very much wanted to be part and to be a member of IoT One. I was absolutely honored to be selected as a member of IoT One, to be nominated as a member of IoT One, I should have said, and then to actually be elected as chair of the IoT One. So that's the Internet of Things One Technical Committee, which is the main one at the BSI. So for me, this idea of embedding and conveying our research and learning and co-producing that research with a technical expertise, because it's not just industry, it's also consumer associations, it's also representatives of small businesses. It's a lot of people that are coming and are being part of standards committees. So being an active player in that particular environment makes such a difference than being an observer of it. And that was my motivation. I wanted to be able to understand more of that process, to contribute to that process, and also vice versa, with that to be able to bring that process back into academia, into education, so that we create this circular learning objective ultimately.
And have you found it a fulfilling experience so far?
Yes, overall, I think that it has been a very, very fulfilling experience. Of course, there are going to be frustrations along the way. We have the same frustrations when we design policy. We have the same frustrations when we do our research, etc. But overall, this engagement with a very interdisciplinary and also multi-stakeholder environment that committees in national standards bodies as well as in international standards bodies and other communities do, other technical communities do, I think that is the most fulfilling experience.
What were your perceptions about standards making before you became involved?
One of the first perception that I had, and also that a lot of people have, is that standards making bodies and communities in general are made up of representatives of big industry. And what I noticed is that that wasn't the case. What I noticed by being a member in IoT One, by being a committee chair in IoT One, but also through my engagement with SPFC now, is that there is a broader interest and passion to represent different communities. And one of them is the SME communities, a community I mentioned before, the consumer associations and other very big stakeholders in this space. So that was one of my main misconceptions. Another misconception, which I'm very happy to see that it's not the case, is that standards making processes are slow. Yes, we know that when we go through this process, they can be relatively slow in the sense that when you engage in a consensus process, you have to go through this, which takes a while. But at the same time, to see that standards making organizations such as the BSI, national standards bodies, are thinking about how to create more adaptive standards making processes is also a fascinating and also a very stimulating experience, and something that, as I said beforehand, I didn't necessarily expect to see, but I'm very happy to be part of.
Now, Irina, I just want to move us on to talk about how you teach standards within STEaPP. Can you tell us on which programs in the department, which programs you teach on? How do they involve standards?
So, thank you, Matthew, for the question. So, mostly I teach in the MPA, which is a Masters of Public Administration. And at STEaPP, we have 5 specializations, but I'm also a co-lead of the MPA in the Digital Technology and Policy Masters. What I try to do there is to always convey this sort of misunderstood relationship between standards, regulation, and policy formulation or policy making. In most of the literature, the academic literature that we see, there is this misconception that standards are always going to be politicized. So they are always going to represent some interests that are somewhat not necessarily aligned to the public interest. And to me, this relationship is not as clear cut as that. It's not to say that this relationship doesn't pan out like this sometimes. There are a lot of standards making bodies and a lot of standards and a lot of codes of practice and a lot of baselines out there that are indeed politicized in the sense that they represent the interests of the few, but I'm not necessarily and always absolutely sure, and through my research I've shown that they always represent that they're always politicized. And the reason why I wanted to get involved with the BSI is exactly because of this, because as a national standards body, you have to make sure that this is whatever standard comes out is consensus knowledge, and that it supports a public policy objective, that it's not necessarily contradictory to that. And also a lot of the ISO standards are again in the same with the same mentality and with the same philosophy underpinning them. So what I try to do in my teaching practice is to introduce students to standards, because a lot of students that are either doing either in public policy or that are in the more technical areas do not understand the importance and the impact and this connection, this relationship between standards, regulation, and policy making. So this is one of the main things that I wanted to achieve in the way that I teach in the masters, in the MPA, the Masters of Public Administration at STEaPP. So at STEaPP, I teach a number of courses. I teach public administration, which is one of the core courses in the Masters of Public Administration. I also teach a course in risk assessment and governance. And of course, I teach a foundational course in digital technologies and policy. And across all of these, I try to embed the idea that standards play a role, and it's not just an idea, it's a reality, right? The standards play a role to achieving a public policy objective, as opposed to just standards being captured by industry, just being big players that deliver something that is going to be necessarily representing their interests, but not always representing a public objective. One of the best ways that we manifested this, and in the work that we have done with the BSI, is through the MPA group project. So here we worked, the UCL STEaPP department worked very closely with the BSI and the BSI student research program to really hone down this idea of what are the gaps that exist in regulation and policy objectives, and how can standards meet those? What are the challenges that some communities, entrepreneurial communities, might experience, and how can standards play a role in meeting their objectives in the absence, actually, of regulations or of new policies that are meant to achieve them. So what we did over the past 2 years is really work together and very closely and very productively with the student research program led by you, Matthew, and put together 2 group projects, 2 MPA group projects, so UCL BSI group projects that really speak to these challenges. The first one last year was looking at the challenges that IoT SMEs, so Internet of Things SMEs, are experiencing. We're navigating the standardization and the regulatory policy landscape, and that has been very successful. And then now, for this academic year, so 2019-2020, we have 5 very, very dedicated MPA master's students who are working very closely with a very, very supportive BSI team to understand more about the standardization and the regulatory challenges for connected and intelligent medical devices. So again, this is at the cutting edge of research, in the sense that there hasn't been a lot of research done in this space. And it's also working very closely with a partner who wants to understand more what's coming from the research side, and also to convey that and to integrate that into the broader standards making practice. To me, this is the epitome of research-based education. And this is ultimately what we are about at STEaPP, and what I am about in the way that I teach for an MPA, which is ultimately a professional master's, a master's in public administration, where we are meant to be equipping the people that are going to be forthcoming in the future to deliver a different perspective on how we think about policy, how we think about regulation, and also how we think about emerging technologies.
All the work that you've described there is really interesting. And how do you see that making a difference in the future of public policy, of education, and of standards making?
So I think there are some immediate actions that we can take in academia and more broadly. Firstly, I think that academics and educational program developers in general can play a more active part in redesigning their curricula to reflect the role that standards play, not just in areas where we see standards featuring already, such as management studies or engineering or design, but actually across the social sciences, for instance, more broadly, across law, across public policy curricula, across political science. I mean, ultimately, standards support the public policy objectives of the 21st century. And I believe that this message can be communicated a bit more clear in curriculum development by providing that baseline of good practice of responsible innovation that I mentioned earlier on. Standards ultimately ensure consumer protection, for instance, in critical areas such as safety, security, cybersecurity, increasingly in areas such as responsible artificial intelligence, machine learning, and ethics when it comes to machine learning, for instance. How we manage misinformation, risk in global supply chains, and a lot of other areas. So I think that these aspects and the role that standards play in meeting these public policy objectives of the 21st century, which are centered roughly around responsible innovation and consumer protection, I think that message can be conveyed more clearly across curricula that do not necessarily sit in one discipline. And I guess I have a second point in terms of the more immediate actions that we can take in promoting education about standardization, which is about ultimately appreciating and conveying more clearly the impact that standards and understanding of standards making processes play. So to me here, a clearer recognition of standards and standard making processes, for instance, in funding calls across economic and social sciences, across engineering and physical sciences, from public bodies, research bodies such as UKRI, I believe that this would play an important part and would potentially change the way that we also understand and reflect on the importance of standards so that we achieve broader education about standards and standards making.
Before we finish, I just want to say that for more information on some of the themes raised in this episode, especially the Student Research Programme, go to www.bsigroup.com/education. Do please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts and share on social media using the hashtag BSIEdPod. And if you have any comments, suggestions, questions and ideas for future podcasts, then please get in touch at education@bsigroup.com. All that remains is for me to say thank you, Irina.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Alan. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Matthew and Irina.
And of course, to thank you for listening.